Some men reach 40 and wonder if they miss their chance at love. Others, like Torvid the Quiet, have stopped wondering altogether. This giant Viking lives alone in the deep forests, where the pine trees grow so thick they block out the sun. He stands taller than any warrior, with hands that could crush stone, but he has never known a woman's gentle touch. For years he keeps to his timber hall, feared by those who remember his rage, pitied by those who know his loneliness. Then winter arrives early, bringing snow and a knock at his door. The woman standing there is not what anyone would expect. She's a widow, broad and strong, carrying the weight of 2 lost husbands and hard-earned wisdom. But when her dangerous past follows her into his peaceful woods, everything changes. What happens when 2 broken souls find each other in the wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The timber hall stood like a fortress against the endless forest, its walls thick enough to muffle the howling wind that swept down from the mountains. Inside, Torvid moved through his morning routine with the precision of a man who had lived alone for too many years to count. The fire needed stoking, 3 logs, split evenly, placed just so. The porridge required stirring, 20 turns clockwise, then 10 against the grain. Each task performed in silence, each movement deliberate and solitary. Above the stone hearth hung his battle-axe, its blade still sharp despite years of disuse. The weapon seemed to watch him as he worked, a reminder of the man he used to be before he chose this exile. Torvid had been 25 when he last swung that axe in anger, 25 when he walked away from the life of a warrior and disappeared into these woods. 15 years had passed since then, 15 years of self-imposed solitude, broken only by the occasional trader who dared approach his hall. The villagers in Greystone, a half-day's walk through the forest, spoke of him in whispers. Some remembered the young warrior who could cleave a man in 2 with a single blow, whose battle cry could freeze the blood in enemy veins. Others knew only the stories, tales that grew more fearsome with each telling. They called him Torvid the Quiet now, not for any peaceful nature, but because he had chosen silence over the roar of combat. Children dared each other to approach his hall, though none ever made it past the tree line. He preferred it this way. The forest asked nothing of him but respect, gave nothing but solitude in return. His days followed patterns he had carved as carefully as the notches he made in the doorframe to mark the passing seasons. Dawn brought wood chopping, the rhythmic bite of his axe into pine and oak filling the morning air. Midday meant checking his traps, following paths through the undergrowth that only he knew. Evenings were for mending, for the small repairs that kept his isolated world functioning. But on this particular evening, as October frost began to silver the edges of fallen leaves, his routine shattered with 3 sharp knocks on his heavy wooden door. Torvid froze mid-stir, his wooden spoon suspended above the pot of rabbit stew. No one knocked on his door. Traders called out from a safe distance, leaving their goods at the forest edge. Village officials sent messengers who shouted their business from beyond the clearing. In 15 years, no one had dared approach close enough to knock. The sound came again. Knock, knock, knock. Firm but not aggressive, the rap of knuckles. That expected an answer. He set down the spoon and approached the door, his bare feet silent on the packed earth floor. Through the small window set high in the wall, he could see snow beginning to fall. Unusual for the season, but not unheard of in these northern reaches. Someone was out there in the growing storm, close enough to touch his door. "Who disturbs? My hall?" he called out, his voice rusty from disuse, but still carrying the authority of his warrior days. "A woman seeking shelter from the cold and those who would do her harm," came the reply. The voice was clear and strong, tinged with weariness but not fear. "I bring no threat to your peace, only need for warmth, until the storm passes." Torvid's hand hovered over the iron latch. In all his years of isolation, no woman had ever approached. His hall, the stories the villagers told were enough to keep even the boldest at bay. Yet here stood someone who either hadn't heard the tales or chose to ignore them. "I am not a man who welcomes visitors," he said through the thick wood. "Nor am I a woman who asks for charity lightly," she replied. "But winter has come early, and there are men on the roads who would see me dead or worse. I ask only for shelter until dawn." Something in her tone, not pleading but pragmatic, made him lift the latch. He pulled the door open slowly, revealing a figure wrapped in a heavy woolen cloak, snow dusting her shoulders like flour. She was not young, perhaps 35 winters, with auburn hair showing threads of silver at the temples. Her face was round and pleasant, marked by laugh lines and the kind of weariness that came from long travel. She was, as he would later reflect, exactly the opposite of what men typically called beautiful. She was broad, where maidens were narrow, solid, where they were delicate, marked by life where they were smooth with youth. But her eyes were the color of deep water, steady and unafraid as they met his gaze. She looked up at him without flinching, though he stood nearly 2 heads taller and blocked the doorway with his massive frame. "You are larger than the stories tell," she said matter-of-factly, stamping snow from her worn boots. "May I enter? The cold grows bitter." Torvid stepped aside, still too surprised to speak. She moved past him into the warmth of the hall, unwinding her cloak to reveal a sturdy traveling dress the color of autumn leaves. At her belt hung a small knife and a leather pouch that clinked softly as she moved. She looked around the hall, with the practical eye of someone accustomed to making quick assessments of shelter and safety. "You keep a tidy home," she observed, hanging her cloak on a peg beside the door as if she belonged there. "And something smells good. Rabbit, if I'm not mistaken." "Who are you?" he finally managed, closing the door against the wind. "Astrid Eriksdottir," she said, moving toward the fire to warm her hands. "Widow twice over, mother of children grown and scattered like seeds on the wind. And you are Torvid the Quiet, though they might have called you Torvid the Tall and been more accurate." He studied her as she warmed herself, noting the way she positioned herself with clear sight lines to both door and window, the habits of someone who had learned caution the hard way. Around her neck, almost hidden beneath her dress, he glimpsed a simple wooden ring hanging from a leather cord. A wedding band, he realized, though her finger bore no such ornament. "How do you know my name?" "Stories travel, even to those who try to outrun them," she said, turning to face him. "The villagers in Greystone speak of the giant who lives in the deep woods, who once was a great warrior, but chose the hermit's life. They say you hate visitors, that you've forgotten how to speak to other souls." "They speak truly," Astrid smiled then, an expression that transformed her weather-worn features. "Well then, we're both disappointing people today. They said I was a fool to seek you out, that you'd as likely kill me as give me shelter. Yet here you are, neither murdering me nor throwing me back into the storm." Despite himself, Torvid felt his lips twitch towards something that might have been a smile. "The night is young. He makes jests. Perhaps there's hope for conversation yet." She moved toward the pot of stew, breathing in the aroma. "When did you last eat a meal you didn't cook yourself?" "I prefer my own cooking." Spoken like a man who's never had anyone else to cook for him. She looked around the hall again, taking in the neat but sparse furnishings, the absence of any feminine touch or family comfort. "May I tend your stew? It's a fair trade for the warmth." Before he could protest, she had taken the wooden spoon and begun stirring with the practiced motion of someone who had cooked countless meals. She tasted it, nodded approvingly, then moved to his small store of herbs and seasonings. Without asking permission, she added a pinch of this and a handful of that, transforming the simple rabbit stew into something that filled the hall with rich, complex aromas. "You cook with skill," he admitted grudgingly. "I've had practice. 2 husbands, 4 children and more hungry mouths at my table than I can count over the years. A woman learns to make much from little. She set the spoon aside and turned to face him fully. Now, shall we speak of why I'm really here? Or shall we pretend this is merely a chance encounter between strangers in a storm? Torvid settled into his chair by the fire, gesturing for her to take the only other seat, a simple stool he had carved but never expected anyone else to use. Speak your piece. Astrid sat with the grace of someone accustomed to making herself comfortable in unfamiliar places. She folded her hands in her lap and met his eyes directly. I am running from my late husband's brother, Gunnar Eriksson. He claims the right to my property and my hand by Norse law, now that my second husband has been dead these 6 months. And you disagree with his claim. I disagree with many things about Gunnar, she said, her voice hardening. He's a cruel man who sees women as property to be owned and used. I would rather die in these woods than submit to his authority. Torvid nodded slowly. He had known men like Gunnar, had served alongside some in his warrior days. How long has he been pursuing you? 3 weeks now. I've stayed ahead of him by keeping to the forest paths, avoiding the main roads. But winter comes early this year, and I cannot travel much further without rest and resupply. She gestured toward the window, where snow continued to fall. When I heard the stories of a warrior who had chosen solitude, who might understand the desire to be left alone, I thought perhaps you might grant me shelter for a night or two. The villagers advised against approaching me. The villagers also said you were a mad hermit who ate the bones of lost travelers. Yet here you sit, offering me your stool and sharing your fire. I've learned to judge for myself rather than trust in gossip. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the wind howl around the hall's strong walls. Torvid found himself studying her face in the firelight, noting the small scar above her left eyebrow, the calluses on her hands that spoke of hard work, the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite her circumstances. You may stay until the storm passes, he said finally, but I warn you, I'm not good company. I have lived alone too long to remember the ways of conversation. Then it's fortunate I have enough conversation for both of us, she replied with that warm smile. And in return for your hospitality, I'll earn my keep. These hands know work, and I suspect a man living alone has tasks that go undone for want of time or inclination. As if to prove her point, she rose and began clearing the small table where he took his meals, wiping it clean with efficient movements. She served the stew into his wooden bowls, setting one before him with a grace that suggested she had done such things 1,000 times before. The simple act of being served a meal in his own hall felt strange and somehow significant, like a ritual he had forgotten he was missing. They ate in relative quiet, but it was not the oppressive silence of his solitary meals. Instead, it felt like the comfortable quiet of two people who understood that words were not always necessary. When she complimented the rabbit, tender, well-trapped, he found himself explaining his snare techniques. When he noticed her favoring her left foot, she told him of the blister she'd earned from days of walking in worn boots. As the evening deepened and the storm showed no sign of abating, Astrid began to tell him about her children. Eric, her eldest, who had sailed west to Iceland to make his fortune. Helga, her daughter, who had married a blacksmith in distant Uppsala and blessed her with 2 grandchildren she had never met. The younger boys, Olaf and Magnus, who had followed their sister north and now served in the household of a wealthy jarl. They write when they can, she said, her fingers unconsciously touching the wooden ring at her throat. But the world is wide, and children must make their own paths. I do not fault them for seeking lives far from the shadows of their mother's troubles. You speak of troubles. Her expression grew careful. Every woman who has lived past her youth has troubles, Torvid. The question is whether she lets them define her or merely inform her choices. He wanted to ask more, but something in her manner suggested the conversation had reached its natural boundary for the evening. Instead, he rose and began banking the fire for the night. You may take my bed, he said. "I will sleep by the hearth. I would not put you from your own rest. The floor by the fire will suit me well enough." No. The word came out more forcefully than he intended, surprising them both. He softened his tone. "A guest should not sleep on the floor. I've slept in worse places than before a warm fire." She studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "You are kind, Torvid the Quiet, kinder than the stories told." As she prepared for sleep, Torvid arranged his blankets on the floor and listened to the sounds of another person sharing his space. The rustle of fabric, the soft padding of feet on packed earth, the gentle sigh as she settled into his bed, all of it strange and somehow comforting after so many years of silence. "Torvid?" Her voice came soft from the darkness. "Yes? Thank you for the shelter, for the meal, for treating a stranger with dignity. There are few enough men in this world who offer such gifts without expecting payment in return." He lay silent for a long moment, staring up at the rafters where shadows danced in the dying firelight. "Sleep well, Astrid Eriksdotter. Tomorrow we will see what the dawn brings." But as he listened to her breathing slow and deepen into sleep, Torvid found rest elusive. For the first time in 15 years, he was not alone in his hall. For the first time in longer than that, he found himself wondering what it might be like to share his solitary life with another soul, even temporarily. The thought should have disturbed him, should have reinforced his desire for isolation. Instead, as the storm raged outside and snow piled against his walls, he discovered that the presence of this unexpected woman brought not disruption, but a peace he had not known he was missing. Dawn broke grey and cold, the storm having passed. In the night, but leaving behind a world transformed by snow, Torvid woke to unfamiliar sounds, the soft rustle of someone moving quietly about his hall, trying not to disturb his rest. He lay still for a moment, listening to Astrid as she rekindled the fire and set water to boil. The domestic sounds felt both foreign and oddly comforting. When he rose and folded his blankets, she greeted him with a nod and a steaming cup of pine needle tea, sweetened with honey from his small store. "You sleep quietly for such a large man," she observed. "I feared I might wake you with my morning routine." "I am accustomed to rising early." He accepted the tea gratefully, surprised by how perfectly she had prepared it. Strong but not bitter, sweet but not cloying. "The storm has passed." "Yes, though it left enough snow to make travel treacherous for a day or two." She handed him a bowl of porridge, enhanced with dried berries and nuts he hadn't even known he possessed. "If you'll permit me to stay another night, I'll be able to continue my journey safely." Torvid found himself hoping she would ask for longer, then immediately questioned the impulse. One night of companionship shouldn't be enough to disturb 15 years of chosen solitude. Yet as he watched her efficient movements around his hall, the way she seemed to bring warmth to spaces he hadn't realized were cold, he felt something shifting in his carefully ordered world. After breakfast, they worked together to clear the snow from around his hall. Astrid proved herself surprisingly strong, her broad shoulders and sturdy frame well suited to physical labor. She worked without complaint, matching his pace and following his lead with the easy cooperation of someone accustomed to shared tasks. "You handle an axe well," he commented, watching her split kindling with clean, economical strikes. "My second husband taught me. Bjorn was a good man, patient with instruction, generous with praise." Her voice carried warmth when she spoke of him. "He said a woman should know how to care for herself, that the world was too uncertain to depend entirely on others for survival." "He sounds wise." He was. Different from my first husband in every way that mattered. Something flickered across her expression. Not quite sadness, but a shadow of old pain. She set down the axe and pulled a small object from her belt pouch. "I carry this with me always." In her palm lay what appeared to be a letter, but one that had been partially destroyed by fire. The parchment was charred around the edges, the writing faded and difficult to read. Torvid could make out only fragments. "Danger approaches. And her mother, you must..." And at the bottom, a signature that looked like Eric. From your son? She nodded, carefully returning the burned letter to her pouch. It reached me just days before Bjorn's death, a warning that Gunnar was making inquiries, asking questions about my whereabouts. Eric tried to warn me, but she touched the charred edges. A cooking fire caught the letter before I could read it all. By the time I beat out the flames, much was lost. But you understood the warning. Enough of it. Eric knew his stepfather's brother better than I realized, knew that Gunnar would not let me live freely once Bjorn was gone. She looked up at him, her expression grave. Gunnar Eriksson is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully. When I refused his first offer of marriage after proper mourning, he began making legal claims. When those failed to move me, he began making threats. Torvid set down his own axe, giving her his full attention. What kind of threats? The kind that made me pack only what I could carry and slip away in the night, rather than face him directly. She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders. He has claimed that Norse law gives him right to his brother's widow, that I am bound to accept his protection or forfeit my property and freedom. He has men who support this claim, men who remember the old ways when women had fewer choices. And your children, can they not protect you? They are scattered too far, building their own lives. Even if they could reach me, I would not ask them to stand against Gunnar. He is dangerous when crossed. Better that I disappear than bring violence to their doors. She met his eyes directly. I know how this must sound. A woman appearing at your door with tales of pursuit and danger. You have every right to send me on my way, rather than risk becoming entangled in my troubles. Torvid considered her words, studying the honest worry in her face. He had lived apart from the world, of legal claims and family obligations for so long that such complexities felt almost foreign. Yet he recognized truth when he heard it, and more than that, he recognized courage. This woman had chosen to face an uncertain future alone, rather than submit to unwanted authority. How long since you fled? 3 weeks. I've been moving carefully, staying off the main roads, sleeping rough when necessary. But winter's early arrival has made travel harder, and I fear Gunnar grows closer. He knows these lands. They were part of his brother's holdings before Bjorn inherited them. As if summoned by her words, a distant sound reached them across the snowy landscape, the baying of hounds carried on the wind. Astrid went rigid, her face paling as she turned toward the sound. Hunting dogs, Torvid said, though he could see she had already recognized them. Gunnar's hounds. He uses them for tracking as well as hunting. She moved quickly toward his hall. I must go. I should never have stayed, never risked bringing this to your door. But Torvid caught her arm gently, his massive hand easily encircling her wrist. Wait, the dogs are still distant, at least half a day's travel, and in this snow the scent trails will be confused. You have time. Time for what? To endanger you further? To bring armed men to your peaceful home? She shook her head firmly. I've seen what Gunnar does to those who stand in his way. You've shown me kindness, Torvid. I won't repay it by making you a target. He looked down at her upturned face, at the genuine concern she showed for his safety, despite her own peril. When had anyone last worried about his welfare? When had anyone considered his peace worth protecting? Tell me about Gunnar, he said quietly. Not his legal claims or his threats, but the man himself. What makes him dangerous? Astrid hesitated, clearly torn between the need to leave and the opportunity to make him understand. Finally, she spoke. He is not large like you, but he is cunning and cruel. He surrounds himself with men who share his nature, those who enjoy causing pain, who see others suffering as entertainment. In the old days, such men were called berserkers, but Gunnar's rage is cold and calculated. How many men? Usually 5 or 6. Warriors, but not honorable ones. They fight together, use pack tactics. She studied his face. You think like a soldier. Were you truly a warrior, or just another village story grown large in the telling? For the first time since she'd arrived, Torvid smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered features from intimidating to almost gentle. I was a warrior once, long ago when I was young and believed that strength alone could solve the world's problems. What changed your mind? The smile faded as quickly as it had come. I learned that some problems cannot be solved, only endured, or escaped, that sometimes the greatest strength lies in walking away from a fight. Astrid nodded slowly, understanding flickering in her eyes. And yet, here you are asking about my pursuer, as if you might not walk away from this one. Here I am, he agreed, though I'm not certain why. The distant baying came again, perhaps slightly closer this time. Astrid glanced toward the sound, then back at Torvid's face. I should go, pack my few things, and leave you to your peace. And go where? You said yourself that winter has made travel treacherous. In this snow, on foot, pursued by men with dogs and horses, how far do you think? You'll get? Far enough, perhaps, or perhaps not, but that is my choice to make, my risk to take. Torvid studied her for a long moment. This woman who had knocked on his door and somehow in the space of one night reminded him of what it felt like to care about another person's welfare. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to let her go, to return to his solitary routine and pretend she had never disrupted his carefully maintained isolation. Instead, he found himself saying, "Stay. Torvid, stay," he repeated, his voice carrying quiet authority. Not as a guest seeking temporary shelter, but as someone who needs protection. Let me offer what I can. She searched his face, looking for something. Perhaps signs of doubt, or fear, or the kind of calculation that would suggest ulterior motives. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because after a long moment, she nodded. Very well, but you should know what you're agreeing to protect. This is not just about a legal dispute or an unwanted suitor. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. There are things about my past, about my first husband's death that Gunnar knows. Things that make his pursuit about more than just claiming a widow's property. What things? But before she could answer, the sound of the hounds came again. Definitely, closer now, carried on the cold air like a promise of violence to come. Astrid's hand went instinctively to the knife at her belt, and Torvid saw in that gesture the confirmation of what he had already begun to suspect. Whatever secrets she carried, whatever had driven her to flee into the wilderness, it was serious enough to make a strong woman very, very afraid. "Tonight," she said quietly, "when we have time and privacy, tonight I'll tell you everything, but first we should prepare. If Gunnar is following the hounds, he'll reach this area by tomorrow at the latest." Torvid nodded, his mind already shifting to tactical considerations he hadn't needed in 15 years. "Then we prepare, and tomorrow, if he comes, we'll be ready for him." But as they turned back toward his hall to begin their preparations, both of them could hear the hounds again. Closer, still, and sounding more determined than before. The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation and discovery. Torvid moved through his hall with the methodical efficiency of a soldier preparing for siege, checking his stores, examining his weapons, mentally cataloguing every advantage his isolated position might provide. But it was Astrid who made the discovery that would shift something fundamental between them. In the corner of the main room, partially hidden behind a stack of firewood, sat an old wooden loom. Dust covered its frame, and spiderwebs stretched between its posts like forgotten dreams. Astrid approached it with the reverence of someone who understood both its purpose and its abandonment. "This is fine work," she said, running her fingers along the carved frame. "Who made it?" Torvid paused in his inventory of arrows to glance at the loom. "My mother. She was skilled with wood and thread both. Was dead these 20 years. Fever took her and my father the same winter." He returned to his arrows, but Astrid heard the careful control in his voice that spoke of old grief held close. "May I?" She gestured toward the loom. He nodded, not trusting his voice. He watched as she carefully cleared away the dust and webs, her movements gentle and respectful. When she found the half-finished weaving still stretched on the frame, a pattern of blue and green that might have been meant for a cloak, her breath caught softly. She was working on this when she died. The fever came quickly. One day she was weaving, the next. He set down the arrows and moved closer. I couldn't bring myself to disturb it. Foolish, perhaps, but it seemed like erasing the last trace of her presence. Astrid's fingers traced the edge of the unfinished cloth with infinite care. Not foolish. Sacred. This is her last gift. Preserved all these years. She looked up at him. But cloth left unwoven grows weak, and tools unused lose their purpose. Would you permit me to finish what she started? The question hit him unexpectedly hard. In all the years since his mother's death, he had barely looked at the loom, treating it like a shrine that was too painful to approach. The idea of someone else completing his mother's final work should have felt like violation. Instead, it felt like healing. She would have liked that, he said quietly. Mother always said cloth should serve its purpose, not gather dust as a monument. Astrid smiled, and he was struck again by how it transformed her face. Then I'll begin tomorrow, after we've dealt with more pressing matters. For now, let me earn my keep in other ways. She moved to examine his torn and mended garments, clicking her tongue in disapproval. When did you last have properly fitted clothing? These tunics hang on you like grain sacks, and this cloak has been mended so many times, it's more patch than original cloth. They serve their purpose. Barely. A man of your size deserves better. She gathered up several garments that were beyond salvation. I can remake these, cut them down and re-stitch them to actually fit your frame. And this, she held up a tunic with a rent across the chest. This tear tells a story. What caused it? Torvid examined the torn fabric, memory flickering. In his eyes, a boar's tusk 3 winters past. The beast was caught in one of my snares, wounded and angry. When I went to dispatch it, it broke free and charged. And you fought it hand to hand? I was unprepared, carried only my knife. The boar was large and desperate. He touched the faded scar on his chest that the tunic had hidden. It managed one good strike before I ended the fight. Astrid set down the torn tunic and moved closer, her healer's instincts overcoming social boundaries. May I see? Without waiting for permission, she lifted the edge of his current tunic, revealing the pale scar that ran from his left shoulder, nearly to his heart. Her fingers traced its length with professional assessment, noting how cleanly it had healed, despite its severity. You tended this yourself? I had no choice. The village healer would not have come so far into the woods, even for a dying man. You did well. It healed clean, though it must have been agony at the time. Her touch lingered on the scar, and Torvid found himself acutely aware of the warmth of her fingers against his skin. You're fortunate the tusk missed the major vessels. Fortune had nothing to do with it. The boar was weakened by the snare, or I would not have survived the encounter. He captured her hand gently, stilling its movement across his chest. You have a healer's touch. I've delivered babies, set bones, tended fever. You learn such skills when you live in small communities, where the nearest physician is days away. She made no move to pull her hand from his, studying his face with new interest. Is that why you live alone? Did someone fail to tend your wounds in your warrior days? No. I live alone because I chose to, after I learned what I was capable of when my blood ran hot with battle fury. He released her hand and stepped back. Some men are not meant to live among others, and yet you've shown me nothing but kindness and consideration since I arrived. You are not an enemy with a sword seeking my death. No, I'm something potentially more dangerous, a woman who sees the man beneath the fearsome reputation. She returned to sorting his clothes, but her tone had grown thoughtful. Tell me about your mother's loom again. What did she weave? The change of subject was clearly intentional, giving them both space to step back from the intensity of the moment. Torvid found himself grateful for her tact, even as he missed the warmth of her touch. Cloaks, mostly. Blankets for winter. She had a gift for patterns that told stories. Scenes from the old legends worked into the cloth itself. That blue and green piece was meant to show the sea meeting the forest, she said. A cloak for travelers who moved between worlds, like her son, perhaps. a warrior who became a hermit, a man who bridges the gap between violence and peace. He looked at her sharply, surprised by her insight. You see much for someone who has known me only a day. I've learned to read people quickly. When you're traveling alone, pursued by dangerous men, survival depends on understanding who might help and who might harm. She folded one of his mended tunics with practiced efficiency. You're not the monster the stories paint, Torvid. Nor are you the simple hermit you pretend to be. You're a man caught between what you were and what you chose to become. And what am I choosing to become by offering you shelter? That remains to be seen. But I hope, she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully, I hope you're choosing to let someone else help carry your burdens for a while. Even the strongest shoulders grow weary when they bear weight alone too long. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and reminding them both that somewhere in the growing darkness, men with dogs were following a trail that led inexorably toward this hall. But inside, in the warm light of the fire, two people who had lived too long in isolation were discovering what it meant to share space, tasks, and the small intimacies of domestic life. As evening approached, Astrid prepared their meal while Torvid arranged his weapons within easy reach. The contrast struck them both, her domestic efficiency alongside his military preparations, normalcy and danger existing side by side. When she served him stew in his own bowl, when he banked the fire for her comfort, they moved around each other with an ease that should have taken weeks to develop. Tomorrow, she said as they settled by the fire, I'll tell you the rest of my story, the parts that explain why Gunnar's pursuit is about more than legal claims or wounded pride. And I'll tell you why I truly left the warrior's life, he replied. Why a man who could kill 12 enemies in a single battle chose 15 years of solitude instead. They sat in comfortable quiet, each lost in their own thoughts, neither quite ready to break the spell of this strange peace they had found together. Tomorrow would bring revelations and perhaps violence, but tonight, for the first time in longer than either could remember, neither of them was truly alone. Morning brought the acrid smell of smoke on the wind and the sound of Astrid moving quietly through the hall, already preparing for what the day might bring. Torvid woke to find her kneeling beside the fire, grinding something in a small stone mortar. Her herb pouch lay open beside her, revealing an array of dried plants and roots that spoke of knowledge accumulated over many years. "What are you preparing?" he asked, rising from his blankets by the hearth. "A poultice for that old shoulder." "Wound of yours," she replied without looking up. "I noticed you favoring it yesterday when we were splitting wood. Cold weather makes old injuries ache, and today we may need you at full strength." He touched his shoulder unconsciously. The old wound, a spear thrust from his last battle, did indeed pain him when storms approached, though he had grown so accustomed to the discomfort that he barely noticed it anymore. "How did you know?" "The way you rolled your shoulder when you thought I wasn't watching. The slight hitch in your movement when you raised your right arm overhead. I've seen such signs before." She continued her grinding, reducing dried comfrey leaves to powder. "My first husband suffered from old battle wounds. I learned to read the signs of pain men try to hide." She mixed the powder with honey and a small amount of rendered fat, creating a pale green paste that smelled of earth and growing things. "Remove your tunic." "That's not necessary." "It is, if you want to be able to draw a bow properly when Gunnar arrives." She looked up at him with that steady gaze that seemed to see through all pretense. "I've already seen your scars, Torvid. There's no shame in letting someone tend to old hurts." He pulled off his tunic, settling on the stool so she could reach his shoulder more easily. Her hands were warm as they explored the old wound, finding the knots of scar tissue that limited his movement. When she began working the poultice into his skin, her touch was firm but gentle, the practiced movements of someone who had eased pain many times before. "Tell me about this one," she said, her fingers tracing the ridge of scar tissue that ran from his shoulder blade around to his collarbone. "A Frisian raider, We were fighting to break their shield wall, and their spear line was deeper than expected. I took the thrust meant for my shield brother. The memory came back clearly. The sharp pain, the warm flow of blood, the desperate push forward that had turned the battle. The spear point broke off inside the wound. I had to cut it out myself after the fighting ended. No wonder it still pains you. Fragments of iron can cause lingering problems. Her hands continued their work, finding tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. Is that the battle where you earned your fearsome reputation? One of them. We were outnumbered 3-1, fighting to protect a village that couldn't protect itself. When my shield brother fell to that spear thrust, something in me changed. He paused, remembering the red haze that had descended over his vision, the feeling of becoming something other than human. I killed 12 men that day, not in honorable single combat, but in a berserker rage that frightened my own allies. Astrid's hands stilled for a moment, but she didn't pull away. And afterward, how did you feel when the rage passed? Empty, sick, like I'd become something monstrous that wore my face. He looked down at his hands, still powerful enough to crush stone, still stained by old violence. That was when I began to understand that strength without control is not strength at all, but weakness disguised as power. Yet you continued fighting for 5 more years. I told myself it was duty, honor, the need to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid that without the identity of warrior, I would be nothing at all. Her hands resumed their gentle ministrations, working the healing herbs deep into the old wound. What changed your mind? A child. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with old grief. Astrid waited, her hands never pausing in their work, giving him space to continue or remain silent as he chose. We were pursuing raiders who had burned a farmstead. When we caught them, there was a fight, brutal and quick. When it ended, I found a boy hiding in the ruins of his family's home. He couldn't have been more than 8 winters old. And when he looked at me, Torvid's voice grew quiet. He looked at me with the same terror the raiders had shown, blood-covered. Axe in hand, I was just another monster to him. There was no difference between the men who had killed his family and the man who had come to save him. So you walked away. I buried my axe where he couldn't see it, gave him water and what comfort I could, then took him to the nearest village. But I knew then that I could never again trust myself in battle. The line between protector and destroyer had become too thin. Astrid finished applying the poultice and began wrapping his shoulder with clean linen strips. And yet yesterday you asked me to stay, knowing it might mean violence. Yesterday I made a choice I thought I'd sworn never to make again, to stand and fight instead of walking away. He turned to look at her as she secured the bandage. You make me want to be something I'd forgotten I could be. What's that? A man who protects what he values, rather than one who simply avoids what he fears. She met his eyes, her own soft with understanding. The child you found. He needed someone to show him that not all strong men are monsters. Perhaps you did. That by your gentleness after the battle, rather than through the fighting itself. Before he could respond, she leaned forward and kissed his forehead, a gesture so tender and unexpected that it took his breath away. You are not the monster you fear yourself to be, Torvid. A monster would not have lived 15 years in solitude, to avoid harming others. A monster would not have opened his door to a stranger seeking shelter. The kiss was brief, almost maternal, but it carried a warmth that spread through his chest, like strong wine. He found himself reaching up to touch the spot where her lips had brushed his skin, as if he could capture the sensation and hold it. We should prepare, she said, settling back on her heels. The smoke I smelled this morning was from a campfire. Close enough that the wind carried it here. Gunnar is perhaps half a day behind us now. Torvid nodded, though part of him wanted to ignore the approaching danger, to pretend that this moment of intimacy could stretch indefinitely. Instead, he reached for his tunic, testing the movement of his shoulder. The poultice had already begun to work. The constant ache had faded to nearly nothing, and his range of motion had improved noticeably. "Your healing skills are considerable," he said. "I've had much practice, unfortunately. 2 husbands, 4 children, and a lifetime of neighbors who had nowhere else to turn when sickness or injury struck." She began packing her herbs away. "I could teach you, if we have time after this is over. A man living alone should know how to treat more than just surface wounds." "After this is over," he repeated, struck by the assumption that there would be an after, that their time together wouldn't end with Gunnar's arrival. "You speak as if you plan to stay." She paused in her packing, her expression growing thoughtful. "I suppose I don't know what I plan. For weeks now I've thought only of staying ahead of pursuit, of surviving from one day to the next. I haven't allowed myself to imagine what might come after the running ends. And now I find myself hoping that when this is finished, whatever the outcome, there will still be room in your quiet life for someone who has learned to value peace above almost all else." The confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable, in a way that made Torvid's chest tighten with emotions he had nearly forgotten how to name. Before he could find words to respond, the distant baying of hounds reached them again, much closer now, carrying on the morning air like a promise of violence to come. Astrid's hand went instinctively to the knife at her belt, and Torvid saw, in that gesture, both her determination to fight for what they had found together and her fear that it might not be enough. He reached out and covered her hand with his own, stilling its movement. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "you will not face it alone." Outside, the hounds bayed again, and both of them could hear in that sound the approach of a reckoning that had been 15 years in the making. The afternoon grew heavy with approaching storm clouds, and with them came the weight of unspoken truths that could no longer be avoided. Torvid found himself studying the hall he had called home for 15 years, seeing it now through different eyes, not just as a refuge from the world, but as a place that might need defending. Above the hearth, his battle-axe seemed to watch him with patient expectation. Astrid noticed his gaze and followed it upward to the weapon that had hung there untouched for so long. "Tell me about it," she said quietly. "Not the battles it fought, but why you kept it when you abandoned everything else from your warrior days." He reached up and lifted the axe from its place, surprised by how familiar it felt in his hands, despite the years of disuse. The weapon was magnificent, its steel head gleaming with oil he had faithfully applied to prevent rust, its wooden handle worn smooth by his grip, carved with runes that spoke of protection and strength. It was my father's, and his father's. Before him, the smith who forged it was said to have mixed the blood of a dragon with the steel, though I suspect that was merely a tale to justify his high price. He tested the weapon's balance, muscle memory guiding his movements. I told myself I kept it to honor my ancestors, but the truth is simpler. I couldn't bring myself to destroy something so perfectly made, even when I swore never to use it again. And now I find myself hoping I still remember how." He set the axe aside and turned to face her. "But first, you promised to tell me the rest of your story, about why Gunnar's pursuit is more than a legal matter." Astrid settled onto the stool, her hands folded in her lap, in a posture that spoke of someone preparing for confession. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but carried the weight of long-held secrets. "My first husband, Gunnar's brother, was not a good man. Eric the Elder, he was called, to distinguish him from my son who bears the same name. He was cruel in ways that left no visible marks, clever enough to hide his nature from those who might have intervened." She looked up at Torvid, her eyes hard with old anger. He used his fists when words failed, his position as householder to ensure I had nowhere to turn for help. "How long did you endure this?" 7 years, long enough to bear him 4 children, long enough to learn that some kinds of courage take time to build. Her fingers unconsciously touched the wooden ring at her throat. The night he died, he had been drinking with his brother Gunnar. They spoke of women as property, of wives who needed correction to remember their proper place. When Gunnar left, Eric decided to demonstrate his philosophy of marriage. She stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the forest as if drawing strength from its shadows. He came to our bed reeking of ale and violence, said he intended to give me a lesson I would never forget, to show me what happened to wives who forgot their station. But that night, for the first time, I fought back. What happened? From the pouch at her belt, she withdrew something Torvid had not seen before, a war hammer, smaller than those used in formal combat, but clearly designed for killing. Its head was blackened with age, its handle wrapped in leather that had been worn smooth by many hands. This belonged to Eric's father, kept as a trophy above our bed. When he started to hurt me in ways he never had before, I reached for anything that might stop him. Her voice grew quiet. I struck him once, at the base of his skull. He died instantly. Torvid studied the hammer in her hands, understanding now why she carried such a burden of guilt and fear. You defended yourself against a man who would have killed you, perhaps, but Norse law does not always recognize such distinctions when it comes to wives and husbands. Eric was well regarded in the community, known for his generosity to guests and his success in trade. Who would believe that such a man had tried to murder his wife in their marriage bed? Your children knew the truth. They had seen enough to understand, though we never spoke of it directly. When the village elders came to investigate Eric's death, they ruled it an accident, a drunken fall that struck his head against the bed frame. But Gunnar knew better. He had helped create the monster his brother became that night. She returned the hammer to her pouch, her movements careful and deliberate. Gunnar waited. He knew I carried the guilt of what I had done, knew that someday he could use that knowledge to claim what he felt was rightfully his. When I married Bjorn 2 years later, Gunnar opposed the match but could do nothing legally. Bjorn was a stronger man than his brother, with allies who would not be easily intimidated. But when Bjorn died, the protection died with him. Gunnar began pressing his claim immediately, saying that Norse tradition gave him the right to his brother's widow, that Eric's death had never been properly investigated. He threatened to bring new evidence to the village elders, evidence that would see me outlawed or worse. Torvid moved closer to her, drawn by the pain in her voice. So you ran. What else could I do? Face trial for a death that was ruled accidental years ago. Submit to marriage with a man who had helped create the conditions that led to his brother's violence. Watch my children be shamed by association with a mother branded as a murderess. She turned from the window to meet his eyes. I chose to disappear rather than fight a battle I could not win. And yet you told me the truth, because you deserve to know what you're risking by sheltering me, because hiding the truth has become more exhausting than bearing it alone. She moved closer to him, close enough that he could see the silver threads in her auburn hair, the lines around her eyes that spoke of sorrow and strength in equal measure. And because, for the first time in longer than I can remember, I find myself wanting to be truly known by another person. Without thinking, Torvid reached out and cupped her face in his massive hands. Her skin was soft beneath his calloused palms, warm with life and courage that had survived years of hardship. You are known, he said quietly, by me for what you truly are. Not a murderess or a victim, but a woman who found the strength to choose life over death when no other choice remained. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as if drawing strength from his acceptance. And you? Will you tell me why the thought of violence troubles a man who was born to be a warrior? Tonight, he promised, when we have time and privacy for such revelations. But first, we must prepare for what's coming. Gunnar will be here soon, and when he arrives, he will not come alone or unarmed. Outside, as if summoned by his words, came the sound they had both been dreading. Not the distant baying of hounds, but the thunder of hoofbeats on frozen ground, growing closer with each passing moment. The hoofbeats stopped just beyond the tree line, close enough that they could hear voices carried on the wind, men discussing strategy, the clink of weapons being checked, the snort of horses being reined. Torvid moved to the window and peered through a gap in the shutters, his warrior's instincts awakening after 15 years of dormancy. 6 men, he reported quietly. All armed, all mounted. They've stopped to survey the approach to my hall. Astrid joined him at the window, her face pale but determined. Can you see Gunnar? The tall one on the black horse, giving orders to the others. He wears mail and carries a sword that has seen use. Torvid studied their positioning, noting how they spread out to cover multiple escape routes. He's no fool. They mean to surround the hall before approaching. What do we do? The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither had fully considered until this moment. Running was no longer an option. The horses would overtake them within minutes. Hiding was equally futile in a hall with only one entrance, and windows too small to escape through. That left standing and fighting, or surrendering Astrid to men who had pursued her across 3 weeks of wilderness. We prepare to receive guests, Torvid said grimly, moving away from the window. Though, I suspect their intentions are less than hospitable. He began gathering his weapons. The great axe from above the hearth, a sword that had been his companion in many battles, a seax for close work. Each blade was oiled and sharp, maintained with the care of a warrior who understood that, neglected. Weapons meant death when the need arose. Astrid watched him arm himself, then drew her own blade, the practical knife she carried for daily tasks, but also the war hammer that had ended her first husband's life. I will not be taken alive, she said quietly. If it comes to surrender or death, I choose death. It will not come to that. He paused in buckling on his sword belt to look at her. I have lived 15 years as a hermit, but I was a warrior for 10 years before that. Some skills once learned are never truly forgotten. Against 6 armed men, I have advantages they lack. I know this ground. I fight from a defensive position, and I have something worth protecting. He moved to her side and tilted her chin up so their eyes met. More importantly, I am no longer the berserker who frightened his own allies. I have learned to fight with purpose rather than rage. A voice called out from beyond the hall, strong and commanding. Torvid the Quiet. I am Gunnar Eriksson, and I come seeking what is mine by right and law. Send out the woman Astrid, and there need be no violence between us. Torvid opened the door but remained in the threshold, his massive frame filling the entrance. At this distance, Gunnar could clearly see his size and the weapons he wore. Astrid Eriksdottir is under my protection. State your business or leave my lands in peace. Gunnar urged his horse forward a few steps, close enough for conversation but still beyond easy axe range. He was a man of middle years, lean and sharp-featured, with the kind of cold eyes that suggested cruelty was more habit than passion. Your protection means nothing in law, hermit. The woman is widow to my brother, bound to accept my guardianship or forfeit her freedom. I have come to claim what Norse tradition grants me. And what does tradition grant her? The right to choose. Her own path, perhaps? Women choose within the bounds of law and custom. Astrid has chosen to flee rather than accept proper authority, a choice that brings shame on her dead husband's memory. Gunnar's voice carried the ring of a man accustomed to having his pronouncements accepted without question. Send her out, and I will be merciful in my correction of her willfulness. Astrid stepped up behind Torvid, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. I have heard your mercy before, Gunnar. I saw what your counsel did to your brother's nature. I will not submit to the authority of a man who taught his kin that wives were property to be broken when they proved inconvenient. Careful words, sister by marriage. You speak of things better left buried with the dead. Gunnar's tone carried a warning that made the threat explicit. Eric died in an unfortunate accident, as the village elders ruled. But accidents can be re-examined if new evidence comes to light. The implied blackmail hung in the cold air. Between them, Torvid felt Astrid tense beside him, her fear of exposure warring with her determination not to submit. He stepped forward, placing himself more fully between her and Gunnar's mounted men. You speak of law and tradition, but I see only armed men surrounding the home of someone who has offered you no harm. If you wish to discuss legal matters, return with village elders and witnesses. If you wish to make threats, know that I am prepared to answer them." Gunnar laughed, a sound without warmth or humor. The hermit grows teeth after so many years of hiding from the world. "But you mistake me, Torvid the Quiet. I make no threats, only promises. The woman has committed crimes that demand accounting. If she will not come willingly, then I will take her by force and let the village elders sort out the legalities afterward. And if she refuses to be taken, then she will face the consequences of her choices, as will any who stand between justice and its rightful course." Gunnar's hand moved to his sword hilt in a gesture that was clearly meant to be seen. "I have 6 good men with me, all sworn to see Norse law upheld. You are one man alone, who has not lifted a weapon in anger for more years than most can remember. Consider carefully whether protecting a murderess is worth dying for." The word hung between them like a blade. Murderess. Gunnar had played his strongest card, the accusation that could see Astrid outlawed or executed if it reached the wrong ears. But instead of the fear he clearly expected to see, Torvid felt something else entirely, a cold, focused anger that reminded him of the warrior he had once been. "I have considered," he said quietly, "and I find that some things are indeed worth dying for. The question is whether you are prepared to kill for your so-called justice. If necessary," Gunnar raised his voice to address his men, "surround the hall. If the woman does not emerge by sunset, we take her by force." As the horsemen began to spread out, taking positions that would cover all approaches to the hall, Astrid pressed close to Torvid's side. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should never have brought this to your door." He looked down at her, this woman who had knocked on his door and somehow, in the space of 3 days, made him remember what it felt like to have something worth fighting for. "You brought me the first real choice I've made in 15 years, he said. "The choice to stand for something, rather than merely avoiding everything." They stepped back into the hall and barred the door, both understanding that the time for words had passed. Whatever came next would be decided by steel and strength, by the old god's judgment of who deserved to prevail. But as they prepared for siege, neither could ignore the fact that sunset was only hours away, and with it would come the test of whether love, found late in life, was strong enough to survive the violence that had driven them both into isolation. The siege began as the sun touched the tree line, painting the snow-covered clearing in shades of copper and gold. Gunnar's men had positioned themselves with military precision, 2 guarding the main approach, 2 covering the rear of the hall where the small window might offer escape, and 2 flanking the sides to prevent any attempt to slip away through the forest. They were patient, professional, and clearly prepared for a long wait. Inside the hall, Torvid and Astrid made their final preparations. He had moved his weapons within easy reach and positioned furniture to create barriers near the door and windows. She had gathered medical supplies and prepared poultices in case the coming fight left wounds that needed tending. Both moved with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that their lives might depend on the next few hours. "They mean to wait us out," Torvid observed, watching through the shutters as Gunnar's men settled into their positions. "Force us to make the first move or surrender from hunger and thirst. Gunnar is cunning that way. He prefers to let his enemies defeat themselves rather than risk honest combat." Astrid checked the edge of her knife, then secured the warhammer at her belt. "But he's also impatient when his authority is challenged. He won't wait more than a day or 2 before trying something more direct." As if summoned by her words, Gunnar's voice rang out across the clearing. "Torvid, I grow weary of this game. Send out the woman, and you may return to your hermit's life with no further interference. Continue to harbor a fugitive from justice, and I will see you branded as her accomplice in murder." "Murder?" Torvid called back. "I thought Eric's death was ruled an accident by the village elders. Accidents can be re-examined when new evidence surfaces, evidence that shows a wife's guilt in her husband's convenient demise." Gunnar's tone carried the satisfaction of a man playing a winning hand. Evidence I have kept sealed out of respect for my brother's memory, but which I will gladly present if forced to do so. Astrid went very still beside Torvid, her face draining of colour. He's bluffing. He has no evidence beyond suspicion and old gossip. But even as she spoke, Gunnar continued. Ask her, hermit, about the night Eric died. Ask her about the war hammer she carries even now, the weapon that belonged to my father and which bears the dent from Eric's skull. Ask her why she kept the instrument of murder all these years, hidden like a guilty secret. Torvid turned to look at Astrid, seeing in her expression the confirmation of Gunnar's words. He knows about the hammer. He always knew. From the night it happened, he knew. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Eric's skull was cracked in a way that no fall could have caused. The wound matched the hammer's head perfectly. But the village elders were paid to rule it an accident, and Gunnar had his own reasons for wanting the truth buried. What reasons? She moved away from the window, sinking onto the stool as if her legs would no longer support her. Because he was there that night. Not in our bedchamber, but in the house. He had been drinking with Eric, encouraging his brother's worst impulses, speaking of wives who needed taming and husbands who had the right to use whatever force was necessary. The pieces began to fall into place in Torvid's mind, creating a picture uglier than he had imagined. He helped create the situation that led to Eric's death. More than that, when I struck Eric down, when I stood there shaking and covered in my husband's blood, Gunnar found me. He had heard the sounds of struggle, the brief cry Eric made when the hammer struck. He came to investigate and saw what I had done. And he helped you conceal it? He helped himself. If the truth came out, it would be revealed that he had spent the evening encouraging his brother to commit what amounted to attempted murder of his own wife. Village justice might well have held him partially responsible for Eric's death. So he cleaned the blood, helped me move the body to make it look like a fall, coached me in what to tell the elders. Torvid felt a cold rage building in his chest, different from the berserker fury of his youth, but no less dangerous. He made you complicit in covering up your own self-defense. And in doing so, he gained power over me that no law or custom could provide. He knew I had killed his brother, knew I had helped conceal the truth, knew I would do almost anything to protect my children from the shame of having a mother branded as a murderess. She looked up at him with eyes full of old pain. That's why he waited so long to press his claim. He wanted me to understand that he held my life in his hands, that defiance would bring consequences I couldn't bear. Outside, Gunnar's voice came again. Smug with anticipated victory. She grows quiet, doesn't she, hermit? Perhaps she realizes that the truth will come out regardless of your protection. Better to surrender now and face Norse justice than to drag an innocent man down with her guilt. But Torvid's attention was fixed on Astrid, on the way she held herself with the careful control of someone who had carried a terrible burden for too long. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I was ashamed. Not of defending myself against a man who would have killed me, but of being weak enough to let Gunnar hold that defense over my head like a blade for all these years. She straightened, some of her natural strength returning. I should have faced the consequences long ago rather than living as his prisoner. And now she rose from the stool and moved to the window, looking out at the men who waited to claim her. When she spoke, her voice carried a resolution that had been building for years. Now I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of letting a cruel man control my life through guilt and fear. Before Torvid could ask what she intended, Astrid moved to the door and began lifting the bar that held it closed. I'm going out there. No. He caught her arm, his grip gentle but firm. That's exactly what he wants. Yes, it is, but not for the reasons he thinks. She looked up at him with a smile that was both sad and determined. Gunnar has made one crucial mistake in all his clever planning. What mistake? He assumes I'm still the frightened woman who helped him conceal my husband's death. He doesn't understand that running from him these past weeks, finding the courage to knock on a stranger's door, discovering that someone could know my worst secret and still find me worthy of protection. All of that has changed me. She pulled the warhammer from her belt, hefting its familiar weight. I'm not running anymore. Astrid, trust me, please. She reached up and touched his face, the same gentle gesture she had used when applying the healing poultice. I know what I'm doing. Against his better judgment, against every instinct that screamed for him to keep her safe behind barred doors, Torvid stepped aside. Astrid lifted the bar and opened the door, stepping out into the clearing where 6 armed men waited to claim her. "Gunnar!" she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered ground. "I would speak with you." Gunnar urged his horse forward, close enough for conversation, but still ready to wheel away if she proved more dangerous than expected. "Have you come to your senses at last, sister by marriage?" "I have indeed." She held up the warhammer so all his men could see it. "I want you to tell them what this is." Gunnar's expression grew wary. "It is evidence of your guilt, as I have said. Tell them whose hammer it was before it became mine. It belonged to my father, passed down through our family for 3 generations. And how did it come to be in my possession?" For the first time, Gunnar seemed uncertain of where the conversation was leading. "You stole it when you murdered my brother." "Wrong." Astrid's voice rang out with the authority of someone finally speaking an unvarnished truth. "It was hanging above Eric's bed when he tried to rape and murder me. I used it to defend my life when your brother, encouraged by your counsel about breaking willful wives, decided to beat me to death for the crime of speaking my own mind." The words hung in the cold air like an indictment. Several of Gunnar's men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, perhaps recognizing a truth that differed significantly from the version their leader had told them. "You lie," Gunnar snarled, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. "Do I? Then tell your men about that night, Gunnar. Tell them how you spent the evening filling your brother's head with ideas about wives who needed harsh correction. Tell them how you helped clean the blood and move the body so the village elders would rule it an accident. Tell them how you've used that night to control me ever since." Gunnar's face had gone pale, his eyes darting between his men's increasingly skeptical faces and the woman who was systematically destroying his carefully constructed narrative. "Tell them," Astrid continued relentlessly, "why a man claiming to seek justice for his brother's murder would wait 7 years to pursue it. Tell them why, if I am truly the murderess you claim, you helped me escape the consequences of my crime." One of Gunnar's men, a grizzled warrior with scars that spoke of many battles, urged his horse closer to his leader. "Is this true, Gunnar? Did you help conceal a murder?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall, and in that moment Torvid understood what Astrid had done. She had turned Gunnar's greatest weapon, the secret he held over her, into his greatest vulnerability. By speaking the truth openly, she had forced him to either admit his complicity in covering up what he now claimed was murder, or face the exposure of his own lies before his men. In the silence that followed, with 6 pairs of suspicious eyes fixed on their leader, Gunnar's hand moved to his sword hilt with the desperate motion of a man whose careful plans had just collapsed around him. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the restless shifting of horses and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Gunnar's men looked between their leader and the woman who had just accused him of complicity in the very crime he claimed to be pursuing. The grizzled warrior who had spoken, a man called Thorvald, if Torvid remembered correctly from old campaigns, kept his hand near his sword hilt, but his eyes fixed on Gunnar's face. "Answer her, Gunnar," Thorvald said quietly. "Did you help conceal this death or not?" Gunnar's face had gone from pale to flushed, his carefully constructed authority crumbling under the weight of truth spoken plainly. "You forget yourselves," he snarled. "I am the one wronged here. My brother lies dead, and his murderess stands free because of the protection of a hermit and the lies of a desperate woman. That's not an answer, another of his men observed, a younger warrior with the keen eyes of someone who had learned to recognize deception in all its forms. Astrid stepped forward, the war hammer still visible in her hand. Then let me provide. The answer he will not give. Yes, Gunnar helped conceal Eric's death. He cleaned my husband's blood from this hammer, helped position the body to look like an accidental fall, and coached me in what to tell the village elders. He did this not out of kindness or justice, but to protect himself from questions about his own role in encouraging Eric's violence. Lies! Gunnar's voice cracked like a whip, but there was desperation beneath the authority now. The ravings of a woman who knows her guilt is about to be exposed. Then let us test the truth, Astrid replied calmly. She raised the hammer so all could see it clearly. This weapon bears the dent from Eric's skull, as Gunnar said. But what he didn't tell you is that he knows exactly how that dent was made, because he was there to see its aftermath. He was in the house when Eric died, close enough to hear the sounds of struggle, close enough to reach our bedchamber within. Moments of the fatal blow. Thorvald's expression grew thoughtful. And why would Gunnar be lingering in his brother's house at such an hour? Because he had spent the evening drinking with Eric, filling his head with ideas about wives who needed harsh correction, about husbands who had the right to use whatever force necessary to maintain their authority. When Eric came to our bed, that night, he was drunk on ale and his brother's poisoned counsel both. From the doorway of the hall, Torvid watched the careful dismantling of Gunnar's position. Astrid had chosen her ground well, not the legal intricacies of marriage law or property rights, but the simpler question of truth versus lies, justice versus revenge. The men Gunnar had brought were warriors, not lawyers. They understood honor and deception, right and wrong, in ways that transcended the complexities of Norse legal tradition. Even if this were true, Gunnar said, his voice growing shriller, it changes nothing. She killed her husband. That is the fact that matters. In defense of her own life, Astrid said firmly. Against a man who had been encouraged to violence by his own brother, a man who came to kill me in our marriage bed. I used the only weapon within reach to save my own life. That is not murder. It is survival. You have only her word for this. Gunnar protested to his men, the word of a woman who admits to killing her husband, but Thorvald was already shaking his head. No, Gunnar, we have more than her word. We have your behavior these past 7 years. If Eric truly died by accident, as the elders ruled, why have you pursued his widow with such determination? If she truly murdered him in cold blood, why did you wait 7 years to seek justice? And most importantly, if you believed her guilty of murder, why did you offer to marry her rather than demanding her trial and execution? The questions fell like hammer blows, each one exposing another crack in Gunnar's carefully constructed narrative. His remaining men shifted uncomfortably, beginning to see the shape of a truth very different from what their leader had told them. I offered marriage out of duty to my brother's memory, Gunnar said weakly. You offered marriage as a way to claim what you felt was rightfully yours, Astrid countered. Property, authority, and most importantly, the silence of someone who knew too much about your own guilt. A wife cannot testify against her husband under Norse law. Marriage would have guaranteed that the truth of Eric's death and your role in encouraging it would never be spoken. Torvald dismounted from his horse, his weathered face grim with understanding. Is this true, Gunnar? Did you help conceal a death you now claim was murder? The question hung in the cold air, demanding an answer that Gunnar could not give without destroying himself. His hand moved to his sword hilt in a gesture of desperation rather than authority. I see how it is, he said, his voice taking on the ugly tone of a cornered animal. You would take the word of a murderess over that of your sworn leader. Very well. If you will not help me claim what is mine by right, then I will take it by force." "Gunnar, don't!" Thorvald began, but the warning came too late. With a snarl of rage, Gunnar drew his sword and spurred his horse toward Astrid, clearly intending to cut her down where she stood. But he had made a crucial miscalculation. He had assumed that Torvid would remain in the doorway, watching the confrontation unfold from a safe distance. Instead, the giant warrior moved with a speed that belied his size, covering the ground between the hall and the clearing's center in 3 long strides. His own sword cleared its sheath with a whisper of steel on leather, rising to intercept Gunnar's overhead strike with a clash that rang like a bell across the snowy landscape. The impact nearly unhorsed Gunnar, his lighter blade turned aside by the massive strength behind Torvid's parry. The horse, frightened by the sudden violence and the crash of steel, reared and danced sideways, forcing its rider to fight for control. "You want to take something by force?" Torvid said quietly, his voice carrying the cold certainty of a man who had found his purpose again. "Then face me properly, Gunnar Eriksson. Single combat, witnessed by your men and judged by the old gods. Winner takes all, Astrid's freedom if I prevail, her submission to your will if you prove the stronger." Gunnar regained control of his mount, his face twisted with fury and fear in equal measure. "You dare challenge me, hermit? You who have hidden from the world for 15 years rather than face honest conflict. I have hidden from nothing but my own capacity for violence. Today, I choose to embrace that capacity in service of something worth fighting for." Torvid raised his sword, the blade catching the last rays of sunlight. "Do you accept the challenge, or will you slink away like a coward who can only threaten women and rely on superior numbers?" The insult hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Before witnesses, Gunnar's men waited to see how their leader would respond to this direct challenge to his courage and honor. To refuse would brand him as craven. To accept meant facing a warrior whose reputation, however distant, still carried the weight of legend. "I accept," Gunnar said through gritted teeth. "Single combat, witnessed and judged by the gods. When you lie dead in the snow, hermit, I will take the woman as is my right, and your death will serve as warning to any who would harbor fugitives from justice." Thorvald stepped forward, assuming the role of witness that tradition demanded. "The terms are set. Single combat between Gunnar Eriksson and Torvid the Quiet, to be fought with sword and shield according to the old customs. The winner claims the right to determine Astrid Eriksdottir's fate. Let no man interfere once the combat begins." As the 2 warriors prepared for battle, Astrid moved to Torvid's side. From her belt, she withdrew a small object and pressed it into his hand, a wooden horse carved with infinite care and worn smooth by years of handling. "What is this?" he asked, studying the tiny figure. "Something I found among your possessions while you slept. A child's toy, whittled with love and kept despite your claims of having no sentiment left." She smiled up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You carved this for yourself when you were young, didn't you, before the world taught you that gentleness was weakness?" He nodded, surprised by the emotion that tightened his throat. He had forgotten about the little horse, forgotten the boy who had spent long winter evenings carving it by firelight while his mother worked at her loom. "Keep it with you," Astrid said. "Remember that the man who carved this still lives inside. The warrior you must become. Violence in service of protection is not the same as violence in service of rage." Torvid closed his fingers around the wooden horse, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. When he looked up, his eyes held a clarity that had been missing for 15 years, the peace of a man who had finally found the balance between his capacity for violence and his desire for redemption. Across the clearing, Gunnar waited with sword and shield, supported by men whose loyalty was already wavering. The sun touched the horizon, painting the snow red as blood, and the wind carried the scent of approaching storm. But for the first time since he had walked away from his warrior's life, Torvid felt no fear of the violence to come. He had something worth fighting for, something worth protecting, and the wisdom to understand the difference between necessary force and mindless brutality. The old gods would judge who deserved to prevail, but the outcome would be decided by steel and strength, courage and conviction. As he raised his sword and settled into the fighting stance, his body remembered despite years of disuse. Torvid found himself almost eager for the test that would determine not just Astrid's fate, but the final measure of the man he had chosen to become. The combat circle formed naturally in the center of the clearing, marked not by stones, but by the ring of witnesses who drew back to give the fighters room. Snow crunched under their feet as Torvid and Gunnar circled each other, each taking the measure of his opponent in the dying light of day. The ancient ritual demanded its due. The formal words, the blessing of weapons, the acknowledgement that the gods would judge the righteousness of their cause. Thorvald stepped forward to speak the traditional words. Let it be witnessed that Gunnar Eriksson and Torvid, called the Quiet, meet in single combat to settle the matter of Astrid Eriksdottir's fate. Let the gods judge between them, and let no man question the outcome of this trial by battle. Gunnar raised his sword toward the darkening sky. Odin All-Father, guide my blade in the service of justice. Thor Thunderer, lend me strength to punish the guilty and protect the innocent. His voice carried across the clearing with practiced authority, but Torvid heard the tremor beneath the words, fear masquerading as righteousness. When Torvid spoke his own blessing, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. I fight not for glory or gold, but for the protection of one who deserves peace. Let my strength serve justice, and let my blade find truth in the heart of lies. The formalities complete, they settled into fighting stances. Gunnar held his sword. In the high guard, shield positioned to protect his torso, feet planted in the classical warrior's pose, taught by weapon masters across the north. He was skilled. Torvid could see it in the way he moved, the confidence of his positioning, the economical efficiency of his preparations. But as they began to circle, Torvid felt the familiar calm descend over him. Not the red haze of berserker rage, but the focused clarity of a warrior who fought with purpose rather than passion. His sword felt alive in his hand, an extension of his will rather than merely a tool of destruction. The wooden horse pressed against his palm where he gripped, it along with his sword hilt, a reminder of the gentleness he was fighting to protect. Gunnar struck first, a probing thrust aimed at Torvid's chest, fast, accurate, designed to test his opponent's reflexes and defensive capabilities. Torvid turned the blade aside with minimal effort, his massive strength making Gunnar's attack seem almost casual. The deflection sent vibrations up both their arms, and Gunnar's eyes widened slightly as he felt the power behind that seemingly effortless parry. They separated, circling again, each having learned something vital about the other. Gunnar now understood that his opponent's reputation for strength was not exaggerated. Direct confrontation would favor the larger man. Torvid had seen that Gunnar was indeed skilled, but skilled in the manner of a man who relied on technique to overcome superior opponents, not one accustomed to facing equals in single combat. The second exchange came faster, Gunnar launching a combination attack. High slash followed immediately by a low thrust, designed to force Torvid into an awkward, defensive position. But the giant warrior moved with surprising grace for his size, stepping inside the arc of the slash and catching the thrust on his sword's strong edge. His counterattack, a powerful overhead strike, forced Gunnar to raise his shield desperately, the impact driving him backward through the snow. "First blood to the hermit," one of Gunnar's men muttered, though no blood had yet been drawn. The comment reflected what all the witnesses could see, that despite 15 years away from warfare, Torvid had lost none of his fundamental skill. With the blade, Gunnar pressed his attack with renewed urgency, perhaps sensing that a long fight would favor his stronger opponent. He feinted left, then came in low and fast from the right. his blade seeking the gap between Torvid's sword and his improvised defense. The move was cleverly executed, and it might have worked against a lesser warrior, but Torvid had fought in battles where such techniques were commonplace, where survival depended on reading an opponent's intentions in the subtle shift of weight or the angle of a shoulder. He was already moving as Gunnar committed to the attack, pivoting to present a smaller target while bringing his sword around in a horizontal sweep that caught Gunnar's blade near the hilt. The impact was tremendous, leveraged by Torvid's greater reach and strength. Gunnar's sword flew from his numbed fingers, spinning end over end to land point first in the snow, several paces away. For a heartbeat, the smaller man stood defenseless, his shield arm raised futilely against the massive warrior who could have ended the fight with a single stroke. But Torvid stepped back instead of pressing his advantage, his sword point lowering toward the ground. "Yield," he said quietly. "Take your men and leave these lands. Trouble Astrid no more, and I will let you depart with your life and what remains of your honor." Gunnar's face flushed with humiliation and rage. Around the circle, his men watched, their leader's disgrace with expressions that ranged from embarrassment to contempt. To be disarmed so completely, so quickly, and then offered mercy like a green boy in his first battle, it was more than Gunnar's pride could bear. "Never," he snarled, diving for his fallen sword. "I will not be defeated by a hermit who has forgotten how to kill." His fingers closed around the sword hilt, just as Torvid realized his mistake. Mercy had been the right choice morally, but tactically it had given his opponent a chance to recover. In his desire to end the fight without taking life, he had forgotten the most important lesson of combat, that some enemies will only stop when they are no longer capable of continuing. Gunnar rose from the snow with his sword in hand, and desperate, fury in his eyes, launching himself at Torvid with the wild abandon of a man who knew he was beaten but refused to accept defeat. His blade swept toward Torvid's unguarded side, aimed at the gap between sword and shield where a lucky strike might yet snatch victory from the jaws of humiliation. The attack was clumsy, born of desperation rather than skill, but desperation could be dangerous in its own way. As Torvid raised his sword to parry, he felt a familiar tightness in his shoulder, the old wound that Astrid's poultice had eased, but which still betrayed him at moments of stress. His parry came a fraction of a second too late, Gunnar's blade sliding past his guard to open a shallow cut along his ribs. The shallow cut along Torvid's ribs burned like fire, but it also brought clarity. The mercy he had offered had been rejected, with treachery, and now he understood that this fight would not end with noble gestures or appeals to honor. Gunnar would continue until one of them lay dead in the snow, and Torvid could no longer afford to hold back the warrior he had once been. Gunnar pressed his momentary advantage, emboldened by the sight of blood on his blade. He attacked with renewed ferocity, no longer concerned with technique or form, simply trying to overwhelm his larger opponent through sheer aggression. His swordwork became a flurry of desperate strikes, each one aimed to maim or kill, each one powered by the fury of a man who saw his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. But desperation, while dangerous in its unpredictability, was also exhausting. Torvid weathered the storm of steel with the patience of experience, parrying what he could not avoid, stepping back when necessary, waiting for the inevitable moment when his opponent's fury would outpace his strength. That moment came sooner than expected. Gunnar overextended himself with a wild overhead strike that left his entire left side exposed. Torvid's counterattack was swift and precise, not the killing blow he could have delivered, but a pommel strike to the temple that sent Gunnar staggering. Sideways, his vision blurred and his balance compromised. "Yield now," Torvid said again, though with less hope than before. "There is no shame in accepting defeat when it is fairly earned." But Gunnar's response was not words, but action, a desperate lunge that caught Torvid off guard with its sheer, suicidal recklessness. Gunnar threw himself forward with complete abandon, his sword extended like a spear, accepting that the move would likely cost him his life if it failed, but gambling that surprise might carry him through Torvid's defenses. The gamble nearly paid off. Torvid twisted away from the thrust, but Gunnar's blade caught the edge of his tunic and carved another shallow furrow across his chest. More importantly, the momentum of Gunnar's charge carried both men to the ground, Gunnar landing on top, with his hands wrapped around Torvid's sword arm, trying to pin the larger man and create space for a killing thrust. For a moment they grappled in the snow, strength against desperation, skill against pure survival instinct. Gunnar was smaller, but positioned advantageously, using his weight to keep Torvid's sword arm trapped, while trying to work his own blade into position for a thrust to the throat or heart. But grappling was not sword work, and here, Torvid's size and strength told decisively. With a surge of power that seemed to lift both men from the ground, he rolled Gunnar aside and came to his feet in a single fluid motion. Gunnar, slower to recover, found himself on his back in the snow with Torvid's sword point at his throat. "It is finished," Torvid said quietly. "Yield and live to see another sunrise." The words hung in the cold air, witnessed by men who understood the mercy being offered. Gunnar lay helpless, his own sword knocked from his grasp in the fall, blood trickling from his scalp where Torvid's pommel had struck. The fight was over by any reasonable measure, decided as clearly as combat could decide anything. But as Torvid stepped back to allow his defeated opponent to rise, Gunnar's hand moved to his belt and emerged with a seax, a long knife meant for close work, concealed throughout the formal combat, and now deployed with the treachery of a man who recognized no limits save his own desires. The blade flashed upward toward Torvid's unprotected belly, a killing stroke delivered by a man who had feigned defeat to create opportunity for murder. It was the act of a coward and oath-breaker, witnessed by all present, and it sealed Gunnar's fate more surely than any formal judgment could have done. But the strike never landed. Astrid, watching from the edge of the combat circle, had recognized the betrayal before anyone else. Her own knife left her hand with the skill of someone who had learned to defend herself through necessity, spinning end over end to take Gunnar in the shoulder and spoil his treacherous attack. The seax fell from his numbed fingers as he cried out in pain and shock. But Astrid was already moving. The war hammer that had ended her first husband's life, now raised to prevent further treachery from his brother. She stood over Gunnar's fallen form, her weapon ready, her face set with the determination of someone who would never again allow herself to be victimized by cruel men. "Enough," she said quietly. "This ends here." Gunnar looked up at her, his face twisted with pain and defeated rage. "You cannot. Norse law demands justice, not the satisfaction of a vindictive man's wounded pride." She glanced around the circle of witnesses, including Gunnar's own men. "All here have seen the truth, that you helped conceal a death you now claim was murder, that you pursued me for years not in service of justice, but to serve your own interests, that when faced with honest combat, you resorted to treachery and oath-breaking." Thorvald stepped forward, his weathered face grave. "The combat is finished. Gunnar Eriksson is defeated fairly and shown mercy, which he repaid with treachery. By witness of all present, his claim on Astrid Eriksdottir is void, his authority forfeit, his honor stained beyond redemption." The formal words carried the weight of law, witnessed and binding. But more than that, they carried the truth that all present could see, that justice had been served not by the letter of tradition, but by its spirit, that the strong had protected the innocent, and that those who would use law as a weapon for personal gain had been exposed and defeated. As village witnesses began to arrive, drawn by the sounds of combat, they found Gunnar bound and defeated, his treachery exposed, his men already distancing themselves from their discredited leader. But more importantly, they found Astrid standing free, her head held high, no longer running from the truth, but claiming her right to live without fear. or shame. The long pursuit was over. The truth had been spoken, and in the growing darkness of early winter, two people who had thought themselves beyond redemption had found instead the courage to fight for something better than survival. They had fought for the right to love, and be loved in return. 1 month later, the forest clearing around Torvid's hall had been transformed. Where snow had once muffled all sound, spring's early arrival brought the music of running water and awakening earth. The timber hall itself showed signs of expansion, new rooms being added, windows enlarged to let in more light. The whole structure growing to accommodate a life no longer lived in solitude. Astrid stood in the doorway, watching Torvid work with an adze to smooth the beam that would support their new bedchamber. His movements were sure and economical, the hands that had once wielded weapons now crafting a home with the same focused intensity. The battle wounds he had taken in the fight with Gunnar had healed cleanly under her care, leaving only thin, white lines to mark where treachery had met its match. "The village priest will arrive before midday," she said, holding up a letter that had come with the morning's trader. "He writes that the wedding ceremony can proceed as planned, assuming you haven't changed your mind about taking such a complicated woman as wife." Torvid looked up from his work, his weathered face creasing with the smile that came more easily. "Now, complicated women are the only kind worth having, I've discovered. Simple ones would never have the courage to knock on a hermit's door in a snowstorm." She moved to his side, inspecting his craftsmanship with the eye of someone who had managed households and understood the importance of solid construction. "Your mother would be proud of this work." The boy who carved wooden horses grew into a man who builds homes with equal care. The small wooden horse he had carried into battle now sat in a place of honor on their mantelpiece, polished smooth by handling and imbued with significance far beyond its simple origins. It had become a symbol of the gentleness that survived. Even in the heart of a warrior, the reminder that strength could protect rather than destroy. From the forest path came the sound of approaching voices, familiar now, but still wonderful to hear. Astrid's children had begun arriving 3 days ago, drawn by news of their mother's wedding and curious to meet the man who had ended her years of running. Eric, her eldest, had embraced Torvid with the fervor of someone who understood what it meant to have his mother safe and happy at last. Helga had wept with joy at seeing her mother's face free of the shadow it had carried for so many years. The younger boys, Olaf and Magnus, had been initially wary of the giant warrior, but quickly won over by his quiet patience with their questions and his obvious devotion to their mother. "They're returning from the village," Astrid observed, recognizing her children's voices among the approaching sounds. Eric will have the final arrangements for the feast, and Helga promised to bring the last of the wedding ale. "Are you ready for this?" Torvid asked, setting aside his tools. "To be bound before God and community to a man who lived 15 years as a hermit? Are you ready to be bound to a woman who killed her first husband, however justly, and whose past will always carry shadows?" They looked at each other in the morning light, two people who had found love late in life and against all expectation. Neither was young, neither was without scars, neither could offer the simple happiness of unmarked hearts. But what they could offer was harder won and more precious, the love of people who had learned its value through loss, the commitment of those who had chosen each other with full knowledge of the cost. "I have never been more ready for anything in my life," Torvid said, pulling her into his arms. "You have given me more than love, Astrid. You have given me purpose and peace, and the understanding that some things are worth fighting for. And you have given me the courage to stop running, to face the truth of who I am and what I've done without shame." She reached up to touch the scar on his chest, the mark left by the boar that had nearly killed him in his isolation. "We have both learned that the wounds we carry can become sources of strength rather than weakness, if we find the right person to share the burden." Their kiss was interrupted by the arrival of her children, loaded down with supplies for the wedding feast and chattering with the excitement of a family reunited after too long apart. Eric carried a small keg of ale, while Helga balanced a basket of fresh bread, and Olaf struggled with an armload of wildflowers gathered from the forest clearings. "Mother," Magnus called out, "the village women are asking if you'll teach them your healing arts after the wedding. They say a community needs someone skilled with herbs and birthing." Astrid smiled, thinking of the loom in the corner where she had finally finished the weaving Torvid's mother had begun so many years ago. The blue and green cloak now hung completed, a garment that told the story of waters meeting forest, of different worlds finding harmony. Soon it would hang around the shoulders of her new husband, a symbol of the life they were building together. "Tell them yes," she said. "A woman should share her knowledge with those who need it, and we'll have time for such things now that the running is over." As the sun climbed higher, friends and neighbors began to arrive for the ceremony. Thorvald came, now serving as unofficial spokesman for the men who had once followed Gunnar and were seeking to rebuild their reputations through honest service. The village elder brought news that Gunnar had been formally outlawed, his properties distributed among those he had wronged. Even the priest who would perform the ceremony spoke of new beginnings and the redemptive power of love freely chosen. But for Torvid and Astrid, the most important moment came not during the formal ceremony, but in the quiet hour before dawn, when they had walked hand in hand to the edge of the clearing where they first met. There, with only the forest as witness, they had carved their names into the bark of an ancient oak, linking them forever with the place where their story began. Now, as the wedding guests gathered and the priest prepared his blessing, 2 rings waited on the altar he had improvised from a section of the old loom. The rings were carved from wood taken from the foundation beam of their expanding home, each one unique but perfectly matched, symbols of lives that had been separate but were now choosing to become one. When the ceremony ended and the feast began, when friends had drunk their health and children had danced around the fire, Torvid and Astrid would retreat to their new bedchamber to begin the private celebration of their union. But even then, surrounded by the sounds of community and joy, they would remember the knock on a hermit's door that had changed everything, the choice to trust a stranger that had led to the greatest blessing either had ever known. Love had found them late in life, marked by loss and complicated by history. But it had found them nonetheless, proving that some gifts are worth any wait, worth any struggle, worth any risk. In the deep forest where winter clung even in summer, 2 broken souls had discovered that they could indeed be made whole, not by forgetting their scars, but by finding someone willing to help bear the weight of old wounds while building something beautiful and new together.